we want to reconstruct the history of life. We want to know when it appeared, where, how, in which conditions, and what kind of light appear. And we want also to reconstruct the history of the Earth. And for that, we need samples. And samples are rocks. So we need rocks. Rocks are great because they preserve both the history of the planet and the history of life. And geologists have defined what we call the geological timescale, which is the time from the accretion of the Earth around 560 billion years ago to now. We divide this long time into slices. These three first slices of time, the Edian, the Archean, and the Proterozoic, form the Precambrian. And the small part here, the last 540 million years, is the Phanerozoic. So life appeared and diversified during this first period, and further in the last period here we have only more diversification. Of course, the time scale is much more complicated than this. You see here the latest version of the geological time scale. So you see time is cut into very thin periods. This whole part is only the last 540 million years ago, the Phanerozoic. So you have lots of dates based on radiometric ages, based also on fossils. We have lots of rocks and fossils preserved from this time period. And you see that the biggest part of the history of Earth, the first 4 billion years, are only a small column in this geological stratigraphic chart. Because there's much less geologists working on this time period, and also less rock preserved, at least at the surface, although this is not always true. Also less fossils, much less is known about the evolution of life, even if some fossils can be very abundant, and I will show you tonight some of them if you want. You will see also rocks from this period, from the Precambrian. So, of course, this is 4.5 billion years of Earth history, but unfortunately or fortunately, we live on a very active planet, which means that not every rock will be preserved because the Earth is very active. There are many geological processes that can erase or alter rocks. You can form mountains, rivers can erase a whole continent. Wind can also alter or remove pieces of rocks. All these processes remove part of the history. And in these rocks that preserve fossils, but some of them are not there anymore, and even if the rocks are still there, they can undergo a lot of transformation. But also life in itself can get preserved in different conditions or not. And we must realize that fossilization is a rare and complex process. So not all forms of life will be preserved in the fossil record. These are examples of modern and fossil lives. And you see that they have different composition, different structures. They can be made of mineral parts, they be macroscopic or microscopic, or be made only of organic parts. And these can be resistant and preserved or not in different conditions. So depending on the type of life and the physico-chemical conditions of the environment where they will be preserved, we will have a bias in the preservation, the fossilization. So not everything is preserved, and the whole rock record is not preserved either. That means we have only a fragmented history. We have only pieces of puzzles of the history of life and the Earth to deal with. But despite this, we can try to reconstruct this history, and the story tells us that before 4.3 billion years ago, Earth was not habitable. It was very hot. You had the magmatic ocean at the surface, but you have here the specialist that can tell you something about that tomorrow, Francis Albared, who's here. Since about 4.3 billion years ago, we think Earth was habitable. We know that because some geologists have studied zircons, tiny minerals that are very resistant, and some of them are as old as 4.2 or even 4.4 billion years ago. And when you do detailed analysis of these minerals, you see that there was some liquid water on Earth at that time, perhaps even some granitoid crust, some kind of continental crust, some conditions that make Earth habitable. Starting at 3.4 billion years ago, perhaps earlier, life diversified. We have evidence of life from then, and I will talk about that a bit later. And in between, we have heavy bombardment by meteorites. The pattern of this heavy bombardment is not very understood. We heard about that yesterday, and we don't know what's the effect of this heavy bombardment on life, if it had appeared before this time period or not. Nevertheless, that's what we can say in summary about the history of Earth. So now, in the first part of the talk, I will talk about misconceptions and challenges into the study of the origin of life, and then the second part we will look at the traces of life. So today life is divided into 3 domains. You have the bacteria, which are very diverse, archaea and eukaryotes. We are eukaryotes, so we are here. And so this is only a tiny domain, as you can see, compared to the other one, and especially the bacteria. So life today is very diverse. There is still a lot of this diversity that we don't know. All these clades with the little red points are clades that we know they exist because we sample the environment and find their DNA or their RNA, but we have no idea what they look like. So there is still a lot of things to explore on Earth about diversity of life. Bacteria and archaea are called prokaryotes. They have a cellular architecture that's quite simple. They don't have a nucleus, they don't have organelles, but they are very diverse in terms of metabolisms, and they are the champion of colonization of our planet. They are everywhere, inside us, outside, everywhere, inside the Earth. Eukaryotes have more complex cells. They have a nucleus, they have organelles, but in terms of metabolism, they are more simple. Even if it's complex, it's still less diverse. So this is life today. So based on life as we know it, we can look at the ingredients of life. It's based on organic chemistry. It needs liquid water. It is characterized by reproduction, metabolism. It uses energy and matter from the environment to grow, to reproduce. It evolves by natural selection. It's also characterized by homochirality. We also heard about that yesterday. Some molecules in the cells are only left forms or the right forms. So for example, amino acids are left-handed, sugar are right-handed. And one cell includes water, macromolecules that are made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. These macromolecules make up the membranes that are made of lipids. The membranes are the compartment in which the constituents of the cells are enclosed. The nucleic acids, like DNA or RNA, are the information that life needs to function. It's the genetic code. Proteins are chains of amino acids. They permit the metabolism and have a lot of functions in the cells. We also have big polysaccharides and a small molecule that gives the energy in the cell. In the cells, we also have elements that are there in traces. They are called macronutrients, and they are metals. And these are very essential to life. Not all of them are in all forms of life, but we need them to live. So these are, for example, iron, zinc, manganese, molybdenum, and so on. So from that, from the constituent of life, as we know it, people have tried to define the minimal conditions for life. What do we need to have life? And this is related to, of course, to the conditions of habitability of a rocky planet or moon. What do we need for life to appear and evolve? So we need liquid water, we need organic chemistry, we need nutrients, and these are usually concentrated in minerals, and we need some sources of energy. Debated questions regard the requirement of a magnetic field that protects an atmosphere, and the requirement of plate tectonics that permit a recycling of the nutrients and a stabilization of the climate over billions of years. But this is a debate, and we will hear about that later on today. So if we look at the element abundance in our galaxy, over 100,000 atoms, we can see that we have a lot of hydrogen, of course, oxygen, carbon, and nitrogen when we need for organic chemistry, or what we need for water. If we compare it to the abundance of silicium, again, we have a lot of hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, and nitrogen, more than silicium. And if we see that, we can guess that water and organic molecules should be common in the universe. And that's what people observe when they look at the composition of interstellar clouds using spectrometer, or when they look at extraterrestrial samples like big or small meteorites. They find this. They find water trapped in minerals. They find organic molecules. This requirement of water had led astrophysicists to define what's called the habitable zone, which is based on the presence of surface liquid water on the planet. So here is the solar system. This is the Earth, and we are right in the right place in our solar system. So not too close from the sun, not too hot, not too far, not too cold. So we have some liquid water on the surface. There are many exoplanets out there around smaller stars or bigger stars, and they need to be closer or further away from their stars to have liquid water on the surface. So this is useful for astrophysicists to try to detect possible habitable rocky planets. But we also know that we know of some liquid water beyond the habitable zone. For example, in this moon, Jovian moon Europa, you have liquid water under the surface. We also know by looking at early Mars or early Earth that liquid water is not always there through the life of a planet. The presence of liquid water varies in time and space. Mars was habitable early in its history. We have signs of water on the surface. And Earth was not habitable early in its history. So the notion of habitable zone based on the presence of surface liquid water needs to be nuanced. Coming back to our element abundance, so water is not a problem, organic matter neither, and this is where a common misconception occurs, and this is because of Berzelius, a chemist. So Berzelius is a famous chemist. He developed organic chemistry, but he saw that chemistry was the organic chemistry was the chemistry only of substances extracted from living beings. It could not be synthesized in the lab. So that was part of what was called the vitalism. There was something special in life that make life different from inorganic matter. So this was in the 18th century until his student Euler succeeded in the synthesis of urea in 1828. So he could do that without using a kidney or an animal, human or dog. That's what is written to his professor. And from then we know that organic chemistry is not necessarily biological. Biology needs organic chemistry, but organic chemistry can be abiotic. Organic chemistry is the chemistry of the molecules, including carbon and hydrogen. And despite that we know that for almost 200 years, you can still find in the literature, in scientific literature, in the press, comments like, we find organic molecules on Rosetta, and so we will understand the origin of life on Earth, or that we find molecules in space, and then that means that life is common in the universe. And you will see further in my talk other examples of this misconception that's still mixing up organic chemistry and biology. So we have water, we have organic chemistry. We also need the nutrients, these elements. These elements are that life needs to function. They are concentrated in minerals. Minerals are very important. They not only concentrate nutrients, but they can also be useful to catalyze chemical reactions. They can be used as surfaces for reaction. They can be used as compartment, perhaps, in the steps from prebiotic chemistry to the origin of life. So they are very interesting and important for the origin of life. But minerals have not been here since the beginning of the story of the Earth. They also have diversified through time. And this is a summary of this diversification made by Robert Hazen. So he's looking at the number of species. So for minerals, we also talk about species. The number of different minerals that appear through time. And you can see that before Earth formed, we have only a few. And then you have a bit more in meteorites. And then you have some alteration of planetesimal, and you have even more. Then you have Earth forming and cooling down. And you have minerals that can start to crystallize. Life appear, you have more minerals again. Then life invents a new metabolism, photosynthesis, that produce oxygen. And there again, this leads to new chemistry and new minerals. And then the next jump in mineral diversification is the biomineralization. So life that is controlling the production of minerals. And there you have again a new types of minerals that will appear. Here it's written that biomineralization starts at 0.54, so in the Phanerozoic, but actually the earliest traces of biomineralization we have so far are these that are 800 million years old. They are beautiful little scales made of apatite, and they are made by probably protists in the Proterozoic. So we have these elements in minerals, and these minerals form rocks. And the geologists that study very old rocks, they can really tell us something interesting about the early Earth and the early conditions. These early rocks include a diversity of mineralogy and conditions. For example, you can have rocks that are made of pebbles that have been transported and glued together to make conglomerates. You have rocks that tells you that there was volcanism, lavas, very hot lavas that sometimes cool down in water and make these pillows. That means there was liquid water. You can have fossil beaches also. You have these ripple sands. You also have deposits very rich in iron. You can have slumps in deep water that we call turbidite. We can have carbonates that have been transformed by what's called metamorphism, high pressure and temperature processes. So all these rocks tell us that we had an active geological cycles already early on Earth. We had some continental crust, volcanism, shallow water environment, tides, rivers even, and so a diversity of habitat. But unfortunately, this rock record goes up only to about 4 billion years. So we don't have rocks that are older than that so far. So we have water, organic chemistry, minerals, nutrients. We need energy. What kind of energy could we have on early Earth for the origin and early evolution of life? Well, there are different sources that are possible. You have the UV lights, lightnings, electricity, the light, heat, different chemical reactions, including redox reactions that exchange electrons between different minerals or elements. The action of waves, dry and wet cycles on beaches. So all these sources of energy are used in models for the origin of life to be tested and see what's plausible. So the ingredients we need for the origin of life are not a problem anymore. We understand where the water comes from degazing and from meteorite mostly. How organic molecules can form abiotically. Some even more or less complex, like bases, sugars, things that life uses later on. Sources of energy are diverse. The nutrients, they are in the minerals. So this is okay. But we still don't know when life appeared. We know that Earth was habitable since about 4.3 billion years, but the rock records stop at 4 billion years. So remember this we know because we have zircons that are resistant. So they are older than the oldest rock record, but they are preserved in younger rocks. They are recycled and preserved in younger rocks. So if life appeared before 4 billion years, we don't have samples to prove it. Not yet, at least. So this is, so we have the ingredient, we don't know when, but what we are missing also, and this is very important, is the recipe. If you put all these ingredients in a pot, you don't see life appearing magically. So we know what we need, but we don't know in which local condition at the nanoscale, where did it happen, where did life occur, in which conditions. We don't know neither what was first. Was it the metabolism that appeared first, or the genetic code, or the membrane, or all together? To have life, what do we need? How simple can a cell be and still considered living? We need a compartment, a lipidic compartment. We need some molecules of information. We need some molecules to make the metabolism, but we don't know in which order and how this appeared. And this is linked to the limits between non-life and life. It was probably a gradual event. So, and also leads to what is life. How can we recognize these steps and how they could be preserved? It is difficult. So here we have time, Earth accretion, habitable Earth since 4.3 billion years ago, the rock record at 4 billion years ago. And this shows the different steps from the origin of life, from molecules, prebiotic chemistry to the first cells, to LUCA. And I show this slide because there's often a confusion between LUCA and the first forms of life. LUCA is the last universal common ancestor. That means the most recent common ancestor of the 3 domains of life that exist today. So it's not the first form of life. It's already a complex population of cells, perhaps with already a lipidic membrane, a genetic code, DNA, RNA, but this is a debate. But it was already complex because it's the most recent ancestor of the 3 domains. Between LUCA and the first cells, we can imagine that there was other types of cells, and they did not survive by natural selection. Only LUCA gave rise to the life we know today. But these, there were probably other possibilities before. So this is important not to confuse both. So with all this, we must realize that we will never know what really happened. We can only less plausible scenarios for the origin of life. This doesn't prevent people to try, and there's a lot of interesting research going on about the origin of life. For example, Jack Szostak in Harvard with his collaborator is studying how vesicles with a double lipidic layer can form just spontaneously. He noticed that some lipids have a particular structure with a part of the molecule that likes water and part of the molecule that doesn't like water. So if you put these lipids in water, they will spontaneously form some vesicles. And these vesicles will have a double layer made of these lipids, just because the part that's like water, the yellow stuff, will direct itself towards water, the water inside and water outside, and the tails of the molecules will go in between. So this is something that self-organizing. If you put more lipids in the solution, the vesicle grow. If you push these vesicles through a little hole, it could be pores in minerals, for example, they can divide without bursting. So you have division. And so you have a simple cycle here of growth and division without any control by genetic code. And then what they did is they put replicas. It's RNA. When you have need a genetic code, you need a molecule and that's folded and that's active. And you need a molecule that's a template that will be copied thanks to this folded molecule. So this folded molecule is a RNA called a replicase. If you put this in solution with this, it will go inside by itself. And then if you have several of them and the template, they will copy themselves. And then you start to have vesicles that grow and divide. And you have genetic information that copy itself and multiply. So right now in these experiments we stop here, but the next step of course in evolution is to have coupling of these vesicle growth and division and replication of the genetic material. And of course they made this already, and we need to start from scratch and have these replicates forming by itself and then meeting this lipidic vesicle and so on. But these are interesting experiments to show that something that looks complicated can happen just by the property of the molecules that auto-organized. There are many different hypotheses concerning the origin of life, and Darwin already thought about it. He wrote in 1871 a letter where he imagined that life could arose in a warm little pond. You probably all heard about that. Other people said, yes, it might have happened there, but perhaps with help of clay minerals, which have an interesting structure and a lot of interesting properties to serve as compartment. Other people prefer hot origin, so this is a lukewarm little pond. You can have a hot origin in deep sea hydrothermal vents, or in even in sub-aerial hot springs. You can have origin of life also in the primordial soup, or helped on beaches with these wet and dry cycles that help to polymerize molecules. And you can have some help from organics that are brought by meteorites, or maybe you don't need that. So there are a lot of hypotheses. So still a lot of questions regarding the origin of life, but so that you don't despair, there is things that we understand now. We understand the origin of the building blocks of life: sugars, amino acids, bases, simple lipids, and phosphates. They can come from chemical reaction on Earth. We can mimic these reactions in the lab. This is Stanley Miller and his famous reactions. We can find some in meteorites. We understand the origin of water from meteorites and degassing. We understand how lipidic membranes can auto-organize. They are of course not as complex as the ones we know in life today, but it's a first step. We also understand how small peptides, small chains of amino acid can form by attaching them to one to each other. And we also understand the formation of nucleotides, again by lab experiments. So nucleotides, they are the bricks of RNA and DNA, and they are made of phosphate, sugar, and bases. And people have succeeded in experiments to show that these can form spontaneously in some conditions. But we still don't know how polynucleotide forms. If you put nucleotides in a pot, they will not attach themselves in the right order to form RNA or DNA. So there's still conditions we don't understand. We don't understand either the origin of homochirality. Remember, we heard about that yesterday. Some molecules in life are only left-handed or right-handed, and we don't know how this happened. And finally, the genetic code is a very complex language. These molecules are rich in information. This, of course, happened by natural selection. We don't know yet how it happened. So now I'm going to the second part of my talk, which is related to the early traces of life. So again, to find life, we need rocks. And to find rocks, we go to nice places like South Africa, that some of you know. And we are welcome in South Africa, as you can see. There are other places on Earth where the early rocks are well preserved, in Australia or in Russia, or even in Scotland, not so far from here. It really depends what age you want to study, what period. So we look for traces of life, and of course, if I show you this, I guess you all agree that this was life. This is an iguanodon from Belgium. This is a T-Rex. I didn't find an iguanodon running, but you get the point. So these are the dinosaurs that Philip likes, but that the meteorite killed. Huh? Well, actually, the birds are dinosaurs, so they didn't die, all of them. But of course, so when we look for life in the Precambrian, we will not look for this. We look for other kinds of life. And we have actually different tools that we can use. We don't have access to genetic the genetic code, or DNA or RNA is not preserved in such old rocks. So we have to rely on other things. We can try to look for biosedimentary structures, which are rocks that are made or influenced by microorganisms, microbial mats. And this can be really big. You see here a huge stromatolite. It's about 2.5 billion years old in South Africa. You see the people there. We can, of course, look for microfossils, and these can be preserved in different ways. They can be preserved as the original organic cell or filament, but smashed in mud, so they are a bit flattened and a bit folded. Or they can be replaced by minerals, like here, or they can be cast by minerals. In these cases, the organics disappear. Or they can be preserved in 3 dimensions in other kinds of rocks called cherts, silica-rich rocks. We can also look at chemical traces of life. We can look at the isotopic composition of organic material and see if we can detect the use of elements by metabolism, such as carbon, sulfur, and nitrogen. Or we can look at fossil molecules such as lipids, membranes, lipids, or pigments that life will produce. For example, here you see a bacterium. If you zoom on this double lipid layer of the membranes, you see that it's made of this kind of lipids. And these can be fossilized. For example, oil, petroleum, it's a juice of dead organism. It's made of lipids and other things. So these molecules can be fossilized in rocks that are not that are well preserved, not too metamorphosed. We have things we can look for, but of course there are many challenges. And more we go back in time, less rocks we have, and more they are altered and they are very transformed by geological processes. And so it's even more and more difficult to prove that we really have forms of life and not abiotic signatures. So the first challenge is the incompleteness of the record. We talked about that already. Not all the rocks have been preserved, not all life has been preserved. We also have a challenge dealing with the geological context, depending on the conditions, the physico-chemical conditions of the environment. Life will be preserved or not, and its traces will be altered or not. If you live in a hot spring in Yellowstone, you will have another preservation than if you live in the Rio Tinto, an acidic river in Spain, for example, or in Antarctica, in ice. All this will determine the kind of life that's there and the kind of traces that life can leave in the rock record. And then there are processes that will alter later the rocks, like metamorphism, mountain building, folding, and all these things. When we look for traces of life in very old rocks, we have to prove that what we look for is really in the rock and not a contamination. This is called the endogenicity. So we can make thin section in rocks and show that, okay, what you think is a fossil is in the rock, but that's not enough. Then you have to prove that this thing that's in the rock has the age as the rock, the same age as the rock. This is called syngenicity. And this is very important because we don't date the fossil, we date the rock that include the fossil. So there are different ways to prove this. You can have a fossil that's flattened parallel to layers of rock, so it was included during the sedimentation. You can use Raman spectroscopy to look at the thermal maturity of the organic material of the fossil and see if it's compatible with the metamorphism of the area that you study. So you have something that's in the rock and that's syngenetic to the rock, but it doesn't mean it's biological. And to find that it's biological, there are different criteria that we can use. We need a combination of evidence. And we also need to show that it could not be produced by abiotic processes. And this is really complicated. For example, we know that isotopic fractionation of carbon can happen through biotic processes, but also through abiotic chemical reactions happening, for example, in hydrothermal conditions, but not only. And recently there were new studies showing that you can even produce organics matter, particulate organic matter, on Earth at low temperature. We find it anyway in meteorites and everywhere in space, so we know already that organic chemistry is not necessarily biological. There are also other processes where minerals will auto-assemble to take complex shapes that look like life. But I will come back to that in the next slide. So a lot of challenges, and if finally we are convinced that what we observe is a trace of life, then we need to interpret it, what kind of life it is. And this is another challenge. So not every life gets preserved, depending on its composition, where it lived, and where it's preserved. Geological processes will alter or erase life traces. See here, you see a nice fold in rocks. This is because our planet is a very active planet, and we'll hear after in the next talk about plate tectonics. Plate tectonics is great because it's creating a lot of habitats, a lot of recycling of nutrients of the earth, a lot of energy for life to use, but it also deforms rocks, erases rocks. And here, for example, you have 3 examples of fossil cells that are microscopic. They are preserved in mud, in shale, so they are flattened and folded. This one is 1 billion year old. It's really well preserved. It didn't see any high temperature or pressure. This one is a bit older, 1.65. It's a bit darker, and this one is 3.2. It's very dark. And if we heat up more these fossils, then we have graphite, pure carbon. So more the metamorphism is important, more pressure and temperature have been important, and they alter the chemistry of these fossils. Here it happens that it's increasing with time, but it's not always the case. For example, in Belgium, around 400 million years ago, you can have fossils that are dark like this because there were some tectonic processes that were important, and this is in Mauritania, and 1 billion years ago, where there was no mountain building close by at that time, and this is well preserved. So it all depends on the geological context, so that's really important, again, to determine. I was talking about the abiotic processes that mimic life, and they produce pseudo-signature. So this is a famous example from a Martian meteorite, where NASA claimed at some point that there was some traces of life, and then people start to study or mimic the condition for the formation of the minerals and show that they were minerals. These are lab experiments showing how minerals can auto-assemble to take shapes that life also uses. These are precipitates that look like a stromatolite, but it's only chemical precipitates. Here, this is a lab experiment showing how you can have complex shape also looking like a stromatolite. And here you have organic material that migrates between minerals. If it migrates around a mineral like this, you see clearly the shape of a mineral, so you don't think this is life. But if it forms little bubbles like this, you might think these are fossil cells, but they are not. These are fluids that are formed by hydrothermal conditions, and they migrate, and sometimes they give the illusion of life, but it's not. And they can be associated with isotopic fractionation of carbon that looks like life, but it's not biological. So how do we do with all these challenges? Well, again, we need samples. So we go in the field, either on the surface with a hammer, or either under the surface where we sample with drill cores. There are many projects sampling the subsurface, like this project in Russia by the ICDP. There are some in South Africa, and hopefully soon a new one in South Africa. And this approach actually will be used also by ExoMars, which will drill only 2 meters, not kilometers, but still under the surface to sample rocks. From there we go to the lab. We can cut these rocks in thin section to see what the rock is made of, what kind of structure it preserves. And all this is to know how it formed, what kind of environment there was, what kind of conditions of preservation there was, and is it possible to have traces of life there? Was it a habitable environment? That's one thing. And was it an environment that could preserve traces of life? And then from there, we can look for life traces. We can destroy the minerals with acids and extract the fossil that resist to these acids, and do all kinds of analysis on these fossils to know what kind of life it is. We can look for fossil molecules in the rock. We can date these rocks, of course, very important. We can do geochemical analysis to know if there was some oxygen in the water column where the sediment deposited, and so on, to reconstruct the paleo environments. We can look at chemical isotopic composition of the organics in these rocks to see if there was some traces of life. And we do that with all kinds of tools from the microscale to the nanoscale with more and more complex analysis. So that's what we do on early Earth rock. We can also study modern environments to understand how preservation happens in different conditions. So, for example, that's a study we did in a lake in Antarctica where big microbial mats are growing. And we looked at drill cores that are only 4,000 years old from the British Antarctic Survey. There you can look at the modern diversity using molecular tools, here in this case cyanobacteria. And then you can look through this little core how these cells are preserved or not. And in this study we could show that some cells are preserved thanks to the encapsulation by clays or small carbonates. And you can have cells preserved, you can have even pigment preserved, so it's a nice model to compare with older fossils. Of course, this is really young, and these processes happen at low pressure and temperature, but it gives us some clue. So in geology, actualism is a principle that's often used. The present is the key to the past. For example, here you see a modern beach where there's some drawing in the sand left by the waves. And you can find this sedimentary structure fossilized in rocks that are 2 billion years old here in Russia, or 3.2 billion years old in South Africa, and there are older examples. That's very important, again, understand the geological context. Are we in an environment where life could live and where life could be preserved? Actualism is also used by biologists to study extremophiles. We know that on Earth life is everywhere, where there is even a little bit of liquid water. So you can find life in very cold and dry conditions with high UV, like in Antarctica, or in very hot and deep environment like hydrothermal vents, or in very salty environment like here or here in Shark Bay, or very acidic river like in Spain, the Rio Tinto. Or these are mats that grow under the ice in lakes in Antarctica. So life has broad limits, and that's what's interesting when you study extremophiles. So extremophiles are organisms that need these extreme conditions. It's not only that they tolerate them, they really need them to reproduce and be happy. So this tells us something about the limits of life that are very broad, the diverse niches that life as we know it can colonize. And it helps us to enlarge our concept of habitability and habitable environments. But we should not forget that this is modern life. So this is life that adapted secondarily from ancestors that may have not lived in these conditions. And it might have nothing to do also with the conditions for the origin of life. So these are analogs that we can use because that's what we have, but they are not perfect analog of early life. And this is something we have to keep in mind. So recently there were several papers talking about traces of life in very, very old rocks, even not in rocks, in minerals, older than the oldest rock that we have on Earth. So this paper was published recently in PNAS. And in this study, they study zircons, the zircon I talked to you about earlier, and they find some carbon in it. They measure the isotopic fractionation of carbon, and they say that the value is consistent with a biogenic origin and may be evidence that a terrestrial biosphere had emerged by 4.1 billion years ago. So from what I told you so far, you can already think about, do you think this is enough to prove that you have life in a mineral? So I told you already that organic chemistry doesn't need to be biological, so it's not because you have carbon that you have life. I also told you that carbon isotope fractionation can be produced by abiotic processes, so it's not a sufficient evidence for life. And in this study, they also use Raman spectroscopy to show that it is an organic material, and that they claim that this Raman spectra shows that the organic carbon is syngenetic to the mineral. To crystallize such mineral, you need temperature at least of 600 degrees or more. And when you have 600 degrees or more, you don't have this kind of spectra. Usually you have things that are different. These are different spectra corresponding to different maturity of organic material. This corresponds more to immature kerogen than to graphite, more metamorphosed material. So this spectra doesn't prove syngeneity. And anyway, Raman spectroscopy doesn't prove biogenicity. It just shows that there is carbon and at what temperature this carbon has been submitted. So even if it's possible that life was there, these evidence are not sufficient to say that this is life. Another recent study claims that there were stromatolites in 3.7 billion year old rocks in Greenland. Again, this is a time when life could have appeared, was probably there, but we don't know. There are different types of rocks, so Earth was habitable, no problem. And the author described these little things, cones, and they interpret it as stromatolites. They did a lot of geochemical analysis of these rocks. But then 2 years later, these authors reassessed this study. They went to the field, they look at the rocks. They look at the rocks from this face of the rock, but also on the side. And when you look at the side of the rock, you can see that these rocks are actually very deformed, and you don't see something like a 3D stromatolite, a conical stromatolite. So they also did geochemical analysis of these rocks, and finally they interpreted this structure as deformation structure formed in very altered carbonate, and this alteration long after the burial of the rocks. So there is an abiotic explanation for these structures. So again here, you need to show endogenicity, syngenicity, biogenicity, and no abiotic processes that can explain what you observe. And here it's clearly not the case. So there are some traces of life that are a bit more convincing. About stromatolites, for example, these stromatolites in the Strellipul Sherd of Australia, they are a bit younger. And here, it's a combination of evidence that can be used to support a biological origin. One evidence by itself is not enough, but if you combine the fact that these stromatolites that are very tiny, you see 10 centimeters here, they occur on a carbonate platform. There are different morphologies that respond to the hydrodynamism of the environment, so if the water is quiet or agitated. There is some organics in these laminations, and it's in the cone and not between the cones, so it's not random. If you measure the carbon composition, the isotope composition of the organics, you see values that are compatible with life, and you have this for carbon and for sulfur. The laminations are not regular like in abiotic precipitates, and the geochemical analysis showed that this was a marine environment, even though these rocks have been very transformed. So the whole set of evidence supports more a biogenic origin than abiotic processes. About microfossils, this is a study we did. I'm talking about this because I know more about this, but it's not the only microfossils that have been described in the Archean. So this is a study we did in the Moody's group in South Africa, where there are beautiful, extensive microbial mats preserved as well. So the geological context is well established. There is lots of dating, lots of sedimentology, notably by Christoph Jobeck, who is a specialist of this area. We have studied some drill cores from old mines. We are hoping to get a new ICDP project to have new, fresh drill cores. And we have lots of evidence of shallow water marine environment with some fluviatile environment as well. So this is really amazingly well preserved. So we look at some of these rocks, cut them in thin section, see things in this thin section. So these things are in the rock. We also show that these things are as the same age as the rock. They are flattened parallel to the bedding. Raman spectroscopy showed that it's carbonaceous, it's kerogen, and the thermal maturity of this kerogen is compatible with the regional metamorphism. So this is syngenetic to the rock. But then is it life or not? Then we extracted these things from the rock with acids. The acid again destroyed the silicates but not the kerogen. And these looks like fossil cells with folds because they have been flattened in mud, preserved, flattened parallel to the layers of mud. But once we cut this in thin, ultra thin section, so you cut a really thin section that's 64 nanometers thick, so very tiny, and look at it with a transmission electron microscopy, you see that it's a hollow vesicle, hollow cell. So you see the wall here and the empty space in between. So for us, this is the ultimate proof that this is biogenic. It's also with a carbon isotope composition that's compatible with life. It occurs as a population. It's only not one, but almost 100. And it's quite large. So we think this is life. We don't know any abiotic processes that could produce this, but we don't know what kind of life it is. And that's why we have a new project. We want to find more and perhaps more diversity and try to really know what it is. But that's not only the only point for the ICDP project, but for me that's the great interest. So once we have life that we are convinced that it is life, once we have fossils that we are convinced that it is life, we still don't know what it is, what kind of life. And you see here a lot of examples of beautiful fossils. Some of them you can see tonight if you want. I brought some. And so they are mostly microscopic here, and except this one and this one. And they are preserved in different ways in different environments. Many are flattened organic compressions in shales, so in mud. Some of them have been preserved in 3 dimensions in cherts, silica-rich rocks. And you have here multicellular filaments or colonies of cells. Some of them have been replaced by minerals, like this has been replaced by phosphate. You can replace organic walls by pyrite or silica or other things. These have built their own skeleton. So you have these nice apatite scales or these tubes made of carbonates. These have agglutinated grains from the sediment and they glue it on a wall, organic wall. So a lot of different forms. When you find fossils, you can have really a lot of them in a sample. But we don't know what they are. So we have different tools to use to try to find out what they are. We can look at the morphology, see if there is a unique character that can compare to modern life. We can look at the wall chemistry, the composition, see if it's made of a biopolymer that's unique in a modern clade, the wall ultrastructure, the isotopic composition also of the organics. This isotopic composition tells us about the evolution of metabolism on the early Earth. You see here the 3 domains of life and different evidence for different clades of bacteria or archaea based on carbon isotope fractionation or nitrogen or sulfur or iron. And these chemical signatures tell us about the evolution of metabolism. But of course, this is the diversity of modern metabolism. So when we measure an isotopic fractionation, we compare to what modern life is doing now. But we don't know if there were early metabolism that could have the same signature, but they were not this metabolism. And we have no idea of the metabolism of life before LUCA. We only know about the modern life. But surely life that appeared before LUCA and maybe coexisted a little bit had also metabolism, otherwise it would not be life. And probably other signatures, or the same, we don't know. So we have a limitation there. So we have a limitation when we look at the traces of life to where we put it in the tree. The tree of life is very dense. There's a lot of clays that disappear, and again we only have a tiny information on what's left. These little lines that's left here, that's the clays that we can try to follow down to Lucca, but it's only a glimpse on the whole evolution of life. So that's something we should not forget. And Darwin, again, a clever guy, already talked about the coral of life, that the tree of life is not a tree, it's not only a trunk, but it's all that's living now, it's living on a lot of dead branches. So, to summarize the challenges to interpret the traces of life, we have the problem of fossilization and what we call taphonomy. It's all the processes that alter living cell to make up a fossil. We can have also convergence between species, clades, or domains of life. For example, here you see eukaryotes, protists, unicellular cells, and bacteria, and they look the same. You can have convergence in morphology, but also in chemistry. Same molecules produced by different organisms. Here you have, for taphonomy, you have the same species that's preserved in 3 dimensions in chert or in 2 dimensions in shale, and can look a little bit different. Some species will have different morphologies depending on their life stages. Here you have a cyst, there you have a vegetative cell that's active. So if you find this in the fossil record, you think there are 2 different species, but actually it's 1 single species. There is a lot of things we don't know about the modern diversity. I told you that earlier. And even on the organism that we know exists, there's still a lot we don't know about it. We don't know what they are made of, if they make some cyst or some structure that can be preserved, what is the composition of their wall, the ultrastructure, all the character that we compare to when we have fossils, but because we don't have access to the genetic code. And here we have a picture where you see a big eukaryote, a protist, but here you have also tiny little protists that are microscopic, the same size as bacteria. A lot of them are still unknown because they are difficult to cultivate. You can detect their genome in a sample of water, for example, but you cannot grow them and you don't know what they look like. And in fossil assemblages, it's very difficult to study such small fossils. So we miss this part of the diversity in the fossil assemblages. There's also the limits of actualism. We cannot compare all modern life to the fossils and vice versa because a lot of life has disappeared. And finally, we don't always know where to put our fossils in the tree of life. I already talked about this when we have very old trees of life. Is it in one of these branches or is it here? We don't know, especially for the early Archean. But even in younger forms of life, when you define a group in biology, you have the first common ancestor of the whole group. This is the extant life, so the forms of a group that live today. This is called the crown group. And here you have the most recent ancestor of these. So these up to there, they all have the same characteristic. So you can relate these fossils to these living organisms. But before you had all these characteristics, you had ancestors that had some of the characteristics, but not all of them. And these are called stem lineages. This is the total group of the whole clade. For example, if you look at arthropods, so arthropods, they include insect, crustacean, and so on. You have a whole group. They diverge from nematodes, some kind of worm, here. So there is a first common ancestor. And then you have all these nice Burgess shale anomalocarid and all these giant arthropods that are stem arthropods. They have some characteristic of the modern ones, but not all of them. And then you have here ancestor that have, and the recent one that have all the characteristic of modern arthropods. And this notion of stem and crown group, you can apply it within a clade or within the whole tree of life. Are you before Lucca, after Lucca? Or within a domain? This is the modern diversity of eukaryotes. All these are eukaryotes. And this is the most recent common ancestor of eukaryotes, LICA. So often when we have fossils, we can tell, not always, but sometimes we can tell if it's an eukaryote or a prokaryote. We can tell you that story another time. But we don't know if it's one of these clades or if it's here between the first eukaryote, this point, and the most recent common eukaryote here. And this is because fossilization doesn't preserve all the characteristics. But nevertheless, even if we have these limitations, we can still use the fossils to know something about evolution of early life. For example, these fossils, they are so far the oldest eukaryotes that we found, the fossils. We know they are eukaryotes because of different criteria, such as the morphological complexity, multi-layered walls, and so on. So this morphology of ornamented wall tell us something about the biology, the fact that it had a cytoskeleton, even if the cytoskeleton itself is not preserved. But we don't know what kind of eukaryote it is. We don't know if it's an ancestor of a modern clade or if it's before LICA. It's still useful because we know we can document the evolution of biological innovation through time, but to identify what it is difficult. We are trying actually to develop new tools to better understand the paleobiology, but that's another story. So if we combine everything I told you, we combine information from geology and paleobiology, again we can reconstruct the evolution of the Earth and evolution of life and see how the biosphere and the geosphere interact. We see that conditions have changed a lot since the formation of the Earth. We went from an anoxic world to a stratified ocean to the world we know today. There were a lot of geological events. They could be extraterrestrial, like meteoritic impact, or they can be terrestrial, like formation of supercontinent and fragmentation, glaciation that were global. All these events have, of course, an impact on life diversity. And life itself, of course, has a big impact on the evolution of the planet. For example, the invention of oxygenic photosynthesis by cyanobacteria completely changed the chemistry of Earth, atmosphere, oceans, and continent, leading to rise of mineral diversity, rise of eukaryotes also. So there is a clear interaction between Earth and life, of course. One thing that we should be careful about is not to conclude when you see that life went from simple to complex and there is a direction in evolution. That's tempting when you see this, but of course these are fragments, these are steps in evolution. But when we are here, we have animals, but we also have bacteria, archaea, and we are all as evolved as all life that lives today has the same level of evolution that it has developed through time. So again, about misconception, we should not confuse the fact to be evolved and the fact to be complex. And life doesn't always go towards complexity. There is a lot of simplification also. The evolution can go to simplification. There is no direction to evolution, which is often people are tempted to see a direction because humans look like they're on the top of evolution, which is not the case. We are just a dot here somewhere. And bacteria and archaea are actually the dominant life forms on our planet. So no direction of evolution, but it's a succession of random events with contingency. Contingency means that not anything can happen from any point in evolution. Once you have something, for example, once you have a bacteria, you are not going to make an archaea. You diversify within the bacteria and so on. But from bacteria and archaea, you can make eukaryotes. So who knows what can happen later? And of course, natural selection. So evolution can be explained, it makes sense, but there is no sense to evolution. And again, here, sometimes people confuse with the meaning of life, and this is a more philosophical issue, but meaning of life is something that we decide each for ourselves, and evolution is just going through different processes with no direction. So in conclusion, the study of early Earth and early life, it's very exciting, and I hope many of you will continue in this direction. Why? Because it can tell you something about the habitability conditions. It tells us definitely something about what are life signature, how to recognize them, characterize them, and how they can get preserved. So in which rock should we look for traces of life on Earth, on Mars, wherever. So it's needed to know how to detect life and to develop missions and decide where we want to land, which instrument to bring with us, what kind of sample to bring back, because there's some analysis that a robot cannot do on a planet. What to look for in the atmosphere of exoplanets where we cannot go by remote sensing. And finally, this whole adventure that's part of astrobiology help us to understand life, Earth, and the universe, whether or not we find extraterrestrial life. It's anyway exciting and interesting. So my last slide is about a misconception that unfortunately many of us are suffering from. What is astrobiology? Some people think that astrobiologists only look for ET, and since we don't know if it exists, we look for nothing, so we are doing nothing. And actually, you know that astrobiology is the study of the origin, evolution, distribution, and future of life in the universe, and Earth is in the universe, so including Earth. And astrobiology means from astrophysics to biology, but through geology, geophysics, chemistry, philosophy, and history. Thank you.